The price I must pay for my infidelity. Dorian stood in the long check-in line at the airport and gazed at the beautiful profile of his beloved wife Salome. She was one of those rare people whose profile was more beautiful than the facade. He didn't just love her, he adored her. It had taken him 30 years to find her, but she was worth every second of the wait. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of her boyish haircut, cute button nose, and chiseled lips. "What's so funny, Dor?" Salome asked with a soft smile, without turning her head. "Nothing, Sal. You're amazing," he replied proudly, examining her long, muscular legs that showed off her yoga pants perfectly. Their relationship had its ups and downs. Dorian was not a simple man. He was a man of principles, and a lot of them. Not many people could live up to his high moral standards. The only one who did was Sal, and she was not an easy person. An uncompromising vegan, a minimalist, an environmentalist, and a volunteer at the orphanage. It's fair to say that if they hadn't met each other, they would likely have been single for a very long time. They met 2 years ago thanks to their mutual friend, Betty. Sal and Betty had been colleagues in the legal department of a large advertising agency for the past decade. At first, Betty had dated Dorian. The spark between them flared up immediately, but their opposing worldviews and Dorian's unwillingness to compromise on almost anything made continuing their relationship virtually impossible. Eventually, however, they became good friends. It wasn't hard for Betty to set him up with her best friend, Sal. They weren't the perfect couple. Dorian was only vegetarian, but not vegan. He belonged to the right camp, and she belonged to the left. He loved dogs, and she loved cats. His Belgian sheepdog didn't like her ginger cat. He preferred to spend time alone with himself, while she preferred socializing, hanging out, and partying. Nevertheless, the commonalities between them exceeded their differences, and love erupted instantly. 10 months after their first date, they were married. In 2 weeks, they should celebrate their first wedding anniversary. A month ago, Sal had stopped taking birth control. They were ready to have children of their own. Dorian worked as a department manager for a large security company, a job arranged for him by one of his former commanders in the Army. His service was shrouded in secrecy. Whatever he did for his country, he did it very well. He retired at 27, having suffered too many losses. Despite the disappointment, his commanders and acquaintances were happy to help him transition to civilian life. Occasionally, however, he was still called up for active reserve duty. This usually happened 3 or 4 times a year, and with very short notice. Fortunately for him, it usually only lasted a few days. His friends and family knew not to ask any questions. Their upcoming trip was related to Sal's work and was a very happy occasion. Once a year, her company would suddenly blow off for 4 days and 3 nights to an all-inclusive resort for employees and their spouses. In addition to free alcohol 24 hours, 7 days a week, there were day and night parties with DJs, stand-up shows, little trips around the island, and special attractions. The company management spared no expense. Dorian was still smiling adoringly at Sal when his phone rang. His smile faded when he noticed the phone number on the screen. "Don't answer it!" Sal shouted hysterically. He wrinkled his face in an agonized grimace and shook his head, but still held the phone to his ear. "Yes? Yes. Got it. I'm on my way." "No," Sal whimpered. "I'm so sorry," Dor whispered sincerely. "You know I have to go, but hey, have fun for both of us, okay?" Sal nodded, clearly mortified. He kissed her quickly, turned on his heels, and walked out of the terminal. Sal was escorting him out with a wistful look when she felt a gentle hand on her shoulder. It was Betty's. "You and I are going to have the best time of our lives," she promised her friend. "From now on, you'll be with me." The flight and drive to the resort were relatively short, and check-in went smoothly. Fortunately, Betty and her roommate, Lisa, had a room not too far from Sal's. Sal gasped when she saw the stunning, deep blue bay, perfectly visible from the balcony of her room. The rooms at the resort hotel were scattered in rows on the hillside that sloped down to the beach. That was where all the restaurants, bars, clubs, and sports facilities were located. Fortunately for Betty and Sal, their room was not too high up on the hill. Otherwise, the climb back up the stairs might have been tedious. After a quick shower and change of clothes, Sal met up with her friends and they went down to the dining room to have lunch, then headed to the bar. Back in Betty and Lisa's room, They were in high spirits. Oscar and Ben, the young copywriters who lived in the next room, walked in uninvited with mischievous smiles. Oscar pulled out a huge joint and asked if they wanted to celebrate. The girls giggled and nodded enthusiastically. "Where did you get it?" Betty asked in surprise. "The clerk who brought our luggage asked if we needed anything else," he said smugly. "And now we have everything we need for our stay." Ben put the mobile speaker on the coffee table and set up his phone's Bluetooth while Oscar smoked a joint. He took a deep breath and then handed it to Sal. As soon as Sal exhaled, melodic techno sounded from the speaker. A pleasant dizziness swept over her almost immediately. A forbidden thought flashed through her mind. If Dor were here with me, I wouldn't be sitting in this room with my friends, enjoying fine marijuana. Dor was making a cross about alcohol, and he was pretty strict about it too. He hated feeling like he wasn't in control. "I'd like him to loosen up a bit," Sal thought. She handed the joint to Betty, nodding her approval that this was a good thing. Soon they were all chattering uncontrollably, giggling and laughing. Well, almost all of them. Most people become chatterboxes after smoking, but Sal tended to shut herself off. Adding alcohol only made her quieter and more introverted. She sank into the chair with her eyes half closed, slowly shaking her head and shoulders, enjoying the music and the pleasant massage sensation that ran through her entire body. Ben left for his room and returned with a bottle of vodka, lemon juice, and disposable cups bought at the duty-free shop. Betty made sure Sal got her drink in a glass tumbler. She wouldn't settle for plastic. After the toast, they began to slow dance to the soothing music in the room. Their vacation was off to the best possible start. Later that evening at dinner, a group of 5 sat at the same table. Sal and Oscar were infatuated with each other and never stopped exchanging flirtatious glances and smiles. When this continued at the bar after dinner, Betty thought they had lost interest in the rest of the group. Sal was in her suite getting ready for the beach party when Betty walked in unexpectedly. "Do you want to tell me exactly what's going on between you two?" Betty asked, not wanting to beat around the bush. "Nothing, actually," Sal replied with some embarrassment. "It's just nice to get a little attention from men for a change. When I'm around Dor, no one dares even look at me. He scares the hell out of them just by his presence." "Nothing?" Betty said skeptically. "I don't mean to be unseemly," said Sal, "but part of me is happy Dor isn't here. He's so tense all the time, even when he's pretending to be calm, and it stresses me out. It's nice, for a change, to feel free and have some fun. If he were here, I wouldn't be able to hang out with you guys in your room, and I certainly wouldn't be able to smoke or drink more than a glass of wine. He's always so serious and cautious, it's boring. When we sit in a restaurant, for example, he always sits with his back to the wall and looks around the front and back entrances nonstop. He thinks I don't notice, but even when he's supposedly talking to me, he's constantly looking at other customers and even pedestrians outside the restaurant. Oscar, on the other hand, is giving me his full attention, not playing the eternal game of agents and spies." "It's not really a game," Betty said sternly. "It's not just that he's used to acting that way. There's a possibility that someone is watching him." "I know, but he's not here right now. He's gone, and I'm alone. So now I have a few days to really relax. This is my first chance in 2 years to relax a little bit, and I'm going to make the most of it." "Just be careful, okay?" "I will." Later that night, Sal went to Betty's room again. She could hear the thudding bass coming from the beach. She wasn't surprised to see Oscar and Ben sitting at the coffee table, holding cups of drinks and smoking pot. When they saw her, their jaws dropped. She was wearing a short, black, strapless dress that left little to the imagination. The 2 stoned men were literally drooling. Sal heard a noise from the bathroom. Betty and Lisa were still dressing. Oscar offered Sal a drink and a cigarette. When Betty and Lisa finally came out, Oscar and Ben looked at each other understandingly. They felt like the happiest people on the island. There was a full moon that night, and the festivities on the beach needed almost no additional lighting. The party started with pop hits and then moved into electronic dance music. By 10 p.m., many of the vacationers could barely stand on their feet. The open bars made everyone too drunk. Betty's band had things about the same. In addition to being drunk, they were also pretty stoned. Oscar wouldn't leave Sal's side, and Betty didn't like the fact that Sal was letting him rape her with his hands here and there. Ben was desperately trying to hit on Betty and Lisa, but he was constantly being rebuffed. It wasn't anything personal. They did the same to every man who made a stand on them and hit on them. No matter how drunk they were, they still knew that betting a coworker was a bad idea. Near midnight, the DJ started playing melodic techno, and the moderate, sensual beat actually warmed things up on the temporary sandy dance floor. Oscar and Sal slowly backed away from the rest of the band to the edge of the crowd. When they thought they were anonymous enough, they drew closer and she wrapped her arms around his neck. He responded by wrapping his arms around her waist and placing his hands on her back, dangerously close to her ass. Besides the copious drinking, smoking, and sensual dancing, there was another factor that made this evening deadly for Sal. Her estrogen levels were at the peak of her period, and so she was very horny. For a moment, Sal stopped worrying about Dora, Betty, Lisa, or anyone else. All she cared about was letting out the sexual tension that had been building up inside her all day and had reached truly insane levels. She turned and pressed her back against him, allowing him to wrap his hands around the underside of her belly. He was running his nose along the back of her neck, and she could feel the delicious heat from the friction. At some point, she just couldn't take it anymore, grabbed his hand and dragged him behind her toward the shore. When she decided they were far enough away from the party and especially from Betty's prying eyes, she pounced on him with a wet and passionate kiss, letting her hands roam all over his body. We won't bring it to an end, she thought. We'll only give each other pleasure once, and we'll call it a day. Follow me, she whispered in Oscar's ear. She walked quickly down the path leading to the stairs, and he followed her. She skipped down the stairs without looking up, deluding herself that if she couldn't see the passers-by, they couldn't see her. When she and Oscar, panting with exhilaration and excitement, reached her room, she had to hand him the magnetic card for the door. Her hands were too shaky to do it herself. Oscar did it perfectly. He knew what was waiting for him on the other side, and so did she. Barely had the door closed behind them as they began to devour each other. After they kissed passionately for a while, she suggested the 69 position to him, and he gladly accepted. Damn, that feels good, she thought. Oscar wasn't as big or muscular as Dor, but he made up for it with great enthusiasm and stamina. The admiration she saw in his eyes rubbed off on her ego. She had abandoned all pretense. The mixture of drinking, smoking, dancing, and love eventually took its toll. Sal simply collapsed from exhaustion on her stomach on the mattress and began to drift into sleep. She could feel Oscar's body pressing against her back. She didn't care, though. She was already too far gone. The last thing she remembered in the twilight of consciousness was his deep groan. The next morning, Sal woke up with a terrible hangover, and Oscar was nowhere to be found. At first, everything was a blur. She didn't realize where she was. The first coherent thought that popped into her head, like a poisonous arrow piercing her temples, was the following. My marriage is over! This horrible thought soon turned to panic. Guilt and shame were beyond her. What have you done? She scolded herself. You are a foolish cheater! She wanted to scream, but couldn't, pulling herself by her hair, but she didn't have the strength to do much damage. She ran to the bathroom to throw up, but nothing came out. She was so thirsty that she drank rusty water straight from the tap in the sink, then went back to the bed and collapsed. Burying herself in the sheets, she cried her eyes out. After a while, a gloomy thought occurred to her, and she ran to the balcony. Ha! The slope, she thought. This is a fucking slope. I can't even kill myself. Desperate and broken, she went back to bed and lay there for hours without moving. In every possible scenario she ran through her head, Dor would eventually find out what had happened. The only way out was to confess, but he probably wouldn't forgive her. And even if he did, their relationship would never be the same again. Dorian wouldn't trust her anymore, and justifiably so. Even she didn't trust herself. She honestly asked herself if she could forgive Dora's infidelity under these circumstances, and the answer was no. At breakfast, Oscar and Ben learned that they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. They were very disappointed, but did not make a scandal. After lunch, Betty and Lisa rented a car and drove to the other side of the island to see a landmark called Pink Beach. They debated whether to invite Sal, but decided against it. She didn't come out for breakfast and lunch, and they decided she needed to be alone. On the way there, they picked up two young Italian hitchhikers. Pink Beach was in a secluded spot, a half-hour walk from the nearest parking lot. The effort was worth it. The pink sand was not only pleasant to look at, but uniquely soft. On the way back, they stopped at a vegan restaurant and ordered takeout for Sal. They also managed to buy a couple of morning birth control pills for her. At first, Sal didn't open the door for them, but after Lisa nearly kicked the door in with her fists, Sal gave in and let them in. She looked awful. Unkempt hair, a puffy red face that spoke of many tears, and the smell of booze that said she hadn't showered since the previous day. Betty and Lisa rushed in and enclosed their friend in a long communal hug. It took a lot of coaxing, but Sal finally agreed to shower and then eat something. However, she absolutely refused to go down to the dining room with them. She didn't want to see the understanding looks and hear the whispers. Completely sober and unable to sleep, Sal spent a long and agonizing night. Her mind was racing, asking hard questions and providing no answers. How would she tell him? How much would she tell him? How would she convince him that it was an isolated mistake and that she was willing to do anything to atone for it? Finally, after all the mental torment, she came to an agonizing decision. She was a practical girl. If she was destined to lose her husband, there was nothing to be done but to go on living in spite of all the grief she would feel. At lunch the next day, Betty and Lisa were surprised to see Sal burst into the dining room in a floral sundress, looking lovely and smiling. She avoided looking at the other diners. Lunch went well, and she even joined them for the final party on the beach in the evening. But this time, she avoided drinking and smoking. At 2 in the morning, Sal heard a light knock on the door. She was awake. Opening the door, she was surprised to find Oscar standing there alone with a pleading look on his face. She shook her head and closed the door. The next afternoon, Betty, Sal, and Lisa stood quietly in line to check in at the terminal for their flight home. Oscar and Ben, standing behind them, couldn't stop talking and seemed very happy. At one point, Betty couldn't stand it any longer, turned, looked sharply at Oscar, and said, "You look too happy for a man whose days are numbered. You must disappear as soon as the plane lands. Dorian will take his time torturing you to death. With his connections, he might even confess to your murder and walk free." Then turned to Ben. "He'll probably think you were his accomplice, Ben. I wouldn't be surprised if he's waiting for you at the airport when we land." Both of them turned white as a sheet. They didn't know anything specific about Dorian's military background, but he was still the biggest, scariest guy they'd ever seen. Sal called Dorian and insisted that he not pick her up from the airport, since Betty would give her a ride home. Sal figured that Dorian, upon seeing her, would immediately realize that something was wrong. She didn't want them to end up in a ditch on the side of the road. When Sal entered the house, Dorian was in the kitchen making dinner. He dropped what he was doing and ran to hug and kiss her, and realized something was wrong when she avoided his lips and instead framed her cheek. An hour later, they were eating dinner in complete silence. The tension in the air was unbearable. "I have some bad news," Sal finally said in a shaky voice. Dor said nothing while Sal tearfully recounted the sequence of events. She held nothing back. She repeated and emphasized that it was an isolated incident, a combination of alcohol, drugs, a special day in her menstrual cycle, and that she would do anything to earn his forgiveness and a second chance. She was practically begging. When she had nothing more to say, Dorian stood up and asked in a somber voice, "You said Betty and Lisa were drinking and smoking with you. Did either of them end up in bed with a co-worker?" "No, but..." He didn't let her finish her sentence. He rushed into the bedroom and started packing a duffel bag. "No!" Betty shouted in front of him. "I'm the one who has to go!" "Shut up!" he hissed. Finished packing, he headed for the front door and saw Sal standing there, blocking his way. "Move over!" he commanded. "No!" she begged. "Please, please stay." He put his big hand on her shoulder and easily pushed her aside. He was about to open the door when she clutched at his arm with all her might and whimpered. Her tears and pain reached him, and he froze. Sal lowered his arm, seeing his broad shoulders trembling. She reached her hand up to his back and almost touched his shoulder, but she was afraid to do so she just held her hand over his trembling body. She wanted so badly to hug him tightly and never let go, but she knew that wouldn't help. She knew that if he ever decided to come back to her, it would only be because he wanted to, not just as a reaction to his wife's pain. He lingered, but eventually left. Dorian was about to drive to the motel when he suddenly changed his mind and made a U-turn. He needed to hear another version of Sal's story from someone he could trust. He also didn't want to be alone. When Betty let him into her apartment, a cup of coffee was already waiting for him. She confirmed all the details from Sal's story and added a few of her own, including that Sal had turned Oscar down last night. She said that for 2 days, Sal hadn't stopped crying, and that at one point she'd even feared for his safety. She also begged him not to pursue Oscar because he wasn't worth the effort, and she said she doubted whether he'd even show up for work on Monday. Dorian sat gloomily for an hour, staring silently at the floor. Finally, he got up, went to the guest room, and closed the door behind him. Betty didn't think this was the right time to ask him for forgiveness or to move on with his life. He needed time to digest everything. At noon the next day, when Dorian still wouldn't leave the room or answer her knock, she set the tray of food by the door and told him she was going to check on Sal. Sal was in worse shape than she had been 2 days ago. It had taken Betty a long time to convince her to eat and drink something. Fortunately, she was too weak and apathetic to resist as Betty dragged her into the bathroom and laid her in the tub. Closing the bathroom door behind her, Betty collapsed to the floor and burst into tears. The 2 people she loved most were in a terrible situation, and there was nothing she could do to help them. The next day, Dorian had not yet made it out of the guest room when Betty returned from work. She decided to make dinner, which included all of his favorite vegetarian dishes, as well as a special baked salmon. She smiled to herself with pleasure as she heard his bedroom door open and then the bathroom door close. Sitting down at the dinner table, he looked almost as usual, even smiled and talked more than usual. After dinner, they sat in the living room with a bottle of wine. "What are you planning to do?" Betty asked. "Get a divorce." "Isn't that a bit hasty?" "She cheated on me the first chance she got. If you hadn't gotten her those pills, she'd be carrying a bastard in her womb right now. She made a terrible mistake, but she's only human. She won't make that mistake again." "Like hell she won't. Once she cheats, she won't stop." "You don't believe in that cliché." "I definitely do. She'd never drink or smoke without you around. I doubt she'd ever go anywhere without you except work. It doesn't have to be the same circumstances for it to happen again. It just has to be the right circumstances." Betty tilted her head and gave him a questioning look, but he just looked at her meaningfully and smiled slyly. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she said. "Not a third, but a second chance. Sal deserves another chance. I'll throw her to the wolves myself if she slips up again. I've known her for 10 years. She's a good person, and she loves you very much. Even good people cheat, and it's the same bad thing. They don't deserve special treatment. I really think you're wrong, not just about all of us humans, but especially about Sal. We can all make critical mistakes when the circumstances are right. Or wrong, I suppose. Why haven't you and Lisa made that mistake? You're not even married." "Well, not being married, we couldn't have made that particular mistake. Although, of course, we had fun. But not with co-workers, and I bet my life you used protection." "Always bet on Betty," she said mischievously. "Tell you what," she said after a pause, "give her another chance, at least for a week. If after that week you decide you can't go on, I understand, but at least try for both your sakes and mine. I love you both very much. I would do anything to keep you together." "Anything?" "Anything. I have an idea, but I don't think you'd like it." "You want to bet?" Sal was in the kitchen cutting vegetables for dinner. Betty had already informed her that Dorian had decided to give her another chance and would be coming home this evening. Hearing the sound of the front door opening, she gingerly turned around. At first, Dorian stood at the entrance looking tense, but as soon as he smiled at her, she dropped what she was doing, ran to him, jumped on top of him, wrapped her legs around his waist, and covered his entire face with kisses. He tried to avoid it like one avoids licking a loving puppy and just stroked her back affectionately. Dinner went pleasantly, and Sal felt no resentment from him. For the first time in a week, she was happy and hopeful. That night, in bed, he politely declined her advances. "It's too soon for me," he explained, and she understood. She didn't delude herself into believing that things would be back to normal in a moment. She had all the patience in the world because there was hope. In the days that followed, they went out to dinner and shopping, cuddled on the couch in front of the TV every night, even kissed and lightly caressed. Everything looked promising. On Friday night, however, Dorian dropped a bombshell. They were sitting huddled together on the couch in front of the TV when Dorian suddenly said, "I've got some bad news." Sal flinched, then looked at him apprehensively. "When Betty convinced me to give you another chance," he said in a cold voice, not taking his eyes off the television screen, "it was on the condition that you felt my pain." Salome tilted her head in confusion. "We can only move on if I get even," he said. "What? What?" Sal stammered. "I'm going to spend the weekend with Betty. If you can get over it when I get back, maybe we can really start over." "She would never dare hurt me like that. She wouldn't. That was my only condition, and she's already agreed. I'll leave tomorrow night and be back Sunday night. We can continue from there." "No, please don't. This is crazy. She's my best friend. Please don't do this to me." Dorian got up and went into the bedroom, leaving Sal crying on the couch. She finally managed to fall asleep there, thinking that this was just a cruel experiment. "They just want to test me," she convinced herself. "This is just some kind of sneaky revenge. Nothing is really going to happen between them." The next night, Sal stood in her bedroom and watched her husband pack his duffel bag. "Don't," she whispered one last time before he left the house. She ran to the living room window and watched him get into his car and drive away. Part of her still believed it was just a wicked prank. When she saw him drive away, she grabbed her keys and ran to her car. Dorian had just entered the lobby of Betty's building when Sal appeared on the street. She parked on the sidewalk in front of the building and looked toward the 7th-floor apartment. She saw a dim light on in the living room, saw shadows of figures flickering on the walls. After about 20 minutes, the light in the living room went out and the light in Betty's bedroom came on. Another minute, and the whole apartment went completely dark. Sal thought she saw the curtains move in the dark bedroom, but she wasn't sure. No one heard Sal's cry of pain in her car. She drove home in agony, tears streaming down her face. At first, she tried to convince herself that this was the price she had to pay for her infidelity, and tried to think of anything else to pass the time. It was no use. Her thoughts kept returning to her husband and best friend. She imagined them pleasuring each other in bed, Betty screaming with pleasure as wave after wave washed over her body. She imagined her husband's adoring face watching Betty, smiling contentedly at him. At some point, her envy and self-torture turned to madness. She fantasized about taking a kitchen knife, running to Betty's apartment and stabbing her to death when she opened the door. She even thought about taking one of the guns from Dorian's safe and shooting them both in the head, but she knew he'd taken the key to the safe with him. He always did. "Yeah, I fucked up big time once," she said out loud, her voice full of disgust. "But not with my fucking best friend, who also happened to be an ex." She called Dorian's cell phone, but he didn't answer. Then called Betty, but all her numbers went to voicemail. She even called Lisa, but she didn't answer. Sal was too upset to realize how late it was. Each rejection was a personal rejection, another part of the conspiracy against her. Finally, in utter despair, she called Oscar. He arrived rather quickly and proved to be an impeccable gentleman. He listened patiently to her frantic screams and explanations, holding out a glass of water to her. When she snuggled into his lap, still trembling, he patted her shoulder gently. When she calmed down a bit, he kissed her head comfortingly, assuring her that everything would be okay. When he saw that the first kiss had helped, he kissed her cheek once more. He didn't resist when she suddenly kissed him wildly. In the bedroom, they repeated all their exercises from the previous night, but this time it was even more exciting and pleasurable. For Sal, it was revenge love, and there was nothing hotter. During the night, Sal woke up from a deep sleep because the light was on in her bedroom. Why does that idiot turn on the light when he goes to pee? She thought to herself. She turned around in bed and felt her hand touch someone's body. If he's still in bed, then who turned on the light? She thought with horror. She propped herself up on her elbows and gazed painfully into what appeared to be two figures. After a few agonizing seconds, her sleepy eyes finally managed to adjust to the light. She saw Dorian and Betty standing at the foot of the bed, staring at her naked body. Betty looked furious, and Dorian was looking at her with pity and disgust, as if watching a gazelle being torn apart by a hyena. "You owe me $500, he said to Betty without looking at her. "Yes, I do," she replied coldly. "You're right. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. The end!